Hi guys, this is the video for the class on abstract expressionism, and we're also going to be talking about conceptual art, which is actually kind of older, but we'll get back to it because it doesn't fit in well until now. So that's why we're going to get back to it eventually. So let's just first set the stage. Right now, we're in the you're seeing a map of Europe, and we're in a time that's just after World War II. Europe has been devastated by World War II. Not only physically has much of many of the cities in the countryside been bombed and millions of people lost their lives, but economically they're completely devastated. Many artists fled Europe during World War II or just before, and they fled to the United States for the most part. And so it was an interesting shift from the U.S., from Europe to the U.S. as the center of the art world. And so this map just doesn't really tell you too much, but you can see that we've been kind of in Europe for years and years and years, and now the center of the art world is in North America. I'm going to give you a quick view of I'm going to look at the work of one artist to kind of illustrate the attitudes of the artists who stayed and were working in Europe post World War II. This is the sculpture of Alberto Giacometti. This is called City Square. And I think one of the things you might, obviously the figures are extremely abstracted, but you might also notice that they have the really exaggerated feet that seem to be almost stuck to the surface, to the podium or the platform, and they are, oh boy, this kitty is bugging me. And they're gone is any sort of reference to classicism. The figures are really weak and almost decayed looking. They look starved. They look really isolated. They're walking aimlessly in different directions. They seem to be social distanced. They seem to be reeling from the war that they're coming from. And much of the art that was coming out of Europe at this time was like this, was just dealing with the aftermath of the war. So this is happening in Europe, and he's not on the AP, but I think it's important for context to just be able to know what was going on. Here's another piece by Giacometti. This is an artist named Francis Bacon, British artist. It's called Head Surrounded by Sides of Beef. He's another European who's reacting to the war. This head, it looks like a pope, and you can see that he looks in a claustrophobic closet, and he's surrounded by two sides of beef that have already been slaughtered and cut in half and all that kind of stuff. So it's a little bit talking about the carnage of war and the kind of post-traumatic stress that all Europeans were feeling following the war. All right, now I'm going to move back to the United States because that's where the AP kind of picks up. One of the people who fled Europe was French artist Marcel Duchamp. This is his work called Nude Descending the Staircase #2. And as you can see, this early piece of Duchamp's looks a little cubist, right? And it was definitely associated with the Cubist futurist movement that happened between the war. Duchamp was an initial member of the Dada movement in France during World War I, but he left Europe after World War I. He decided that the insanity of war in Europe was something more than he could handle. And so this is an early work. We're going to go to this next piece, and this is the piece that's on the AP. It's a really interesting piece. So he was from this Dada movement, which is all about kind of poking fun, wordplay, questioning everything, questioning not only politics and politicians, but also questioning the art world and what authority the art world had to impose rules or to impose limitations on artists. Art, according to Duchamp, should not just appeal to one's senses based on the form or the look of the art, but it should appeal to the intellect. And there's no question that Duchamp was all about the great intellect of artists. He was a super intellectual. All right. So Marcel Duchamp, as I mentioned, moved to New York City, and he was starting to play around with this idea of non-art. And he called these pieces of non-art, including this one. This one is called Fountain. It was created way before, so I'm up in the 40s, but this one was created in the 1917, so it's pretty old. But I saved it till now, even though it's a little out of the timeline, because we really haven't talked about anything like this. And it's really now that artists are throwing out conventions and just throwing out conventions. So Marcel Duchamp was way ahead of most artists. He called these non-art pieces like Fountain ready-mades, quote unquote, ready-mades. And it wasn't anything he made. As a matter of fact, as you can see, and as I'm sure you've read, it's a urinal. But he's taken the urinal and he's flipped it around. So the bottom part that's resting on the podium right here is the back that would normally be attached to the wall. And then men could urinate into this area that would protrude from the wall. So it's like a toilet, right? So he's taken this ceramic toilet that's manufactured by a company in the United States. It's an unused toilet, and he's disconnected it from the plumbing, and he's flipped it around so it really can't be used. And then he's signed it, R. Mutt. Now, R. Mutt, 1917, so he's dated it too. R. Mutt, of course, is not his name. His name is Marcel Duchamp. Our Mutt is a little bit of a play on words of the manufacturer. The manufacturer who made this ceramic toilet was J.L. Mott, M-O-T-T, not R-M-U-T-T. So the play on words, Mutt, is also, a dog. And it's also, it plays with this popular graffiti that was happening during World War I also. So Duchamp entered the Fountain in the American Society of Independent Artists exhibit in 1917. He entered it it was an open exhibit that was held at the Armory in New York. He was a founding member of this group, and he did it anonymously. He didn't say that it was his work of art, and he just entered it. And the jury, who he was not on, rejected it. They decided that it was not art and that it was also indecent. So not only did they find it, I mean, just think about all the art that people have found indecent over the last few weeks that we've been studying so much, the nudity, the sexual overtones, so much indecent art. And this was also was also found to be indecent. Of course, it's a urinal. It's meant to hold human waste. So, I can get that. I don't know that they found it to be indecent as much as they found it to be disrespectful. And he was shocked. He was shocked that they didn't have a more open mind. And so let's just think a little bit about what Duchamp is trying to say with this piece. I need you to really try to get your head around this. What Duchamp is saying is that art doesn't need to be some lovely craft that you have manual skills to create. He's saying art is an idea. And it doesn't need to be. It doesn't need to take the form of something that one makes. And at its highest, it's an idea. A little bit like Brancusi was saying with his really pared down sculptures. It wasn't about the form. The kiss was this rough form, but it was more for him about the idea. And now Duchamp has taken that even further. He said, I'm not even going to touch, this isn't something I made. I'm just saying this is art because I say it's art and I render it useless in terms of its practical use, is it not art? Why not? Why isn't it art? He's saying that anything can be art. It frees it from the shackles of craft that one has to perfect with one's hand, and moves it into the intellectual realm. Can art be just an idea? And that's what his ready-mades were really, really asking artists and people to grapple with. And these artists who first saw this piece were saying, no, this can't be art. You didn't do anything. You just signed it. You didn't make it. You didn't touch it. It wasn't yours. You just appropriated it. And Duchamp was like, but it was my idea to use it as art. Is that not art? Okay, so I'm going to engage you in the argument. Is the fountain art? If you think the fountain is art, great. You tell me why. Why is this art? I want you to think about all the arguments that his contemporaries had for saying it wasn't art. And I want you to think about Duchamp's arguments for saying why it is art. Can art be just an idea? And in this case, just an idea made manifest in this urinal, which is a little provocative, right? So is it art? You tell me why. If you don't think it's art, you tell me why not. And can you defend that? Does it have to fit certain parameters? So is it art? Is it not art? Tell me yes or no, and your defense for that. And this is such a fun argument to have in class, because there's usually somebody who takes both, people who take both sides. And I love the intellectual exercise of going through it, because if you take it to its logical extreme, where it actually takes no form at all, where it's just an idea, and it actually doesn't take form physically and manifest in the world, then you get to that point where you're like, oh, is that okay? Can art really live in the realm of ideas that nobody else can see? Super interesting, really interesting idea. Okay, I'm going to show you a few more of Duchamp's ready-mades. This one is, I don't remember the name of this one. I'm so sorry. I think this is a bicycle wheel mounted on a stool, and I can't remember the name of it, and I apologize for that. But again, it's the same idea. He's taken two practical objects, a stool and a bicycle wheel, and rendered them useless by putting them together. So he had nothing to do with the manufacture of either of them, but he decided to put the two together to create a statement, to put forward an idea. And again, the idea is, because I am calling it art, because I think it is interesting, that it becomes art. All right, and one more piece by Duchamp. This one is called LHOOQ. And it's a postcard, right? This is a postcard of the famous Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci, that he has taken, Marcel Duchamp, and graffitied. He's taken and he's put a mustache on her. He's actually signed it right here and put the title of Paris, and then titled it. So he's taken a reproduction of somebody else's artwork, and he has signed it, because he's defaced it, he's changed it, and now so now he's claiming it's his, because he's taken Leonardo's idea and made it his own. Super interesting. So he's kind of going one step beyond the manufactured things. Now he's actually appropriating somebody else's art and calling it his own, because he's changed it up. And he's made it kind of a joke. Again, this kind of goes back to this whole Dada idea of questioning reality, questioning artists, the limitations of art. What is the role of an artist? It's kind of interesting. It isn't a ready-made, but it's an appropriated piece of art that he has kind of repurposed and repackaged as his own. So you can add this one into your argument if you'd like to. It's incredibly interesting. All right, we're going to go on to the abstract expressionists. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what was going on in New York at the time. So New York City, like I mentioned before, became the center of the art world in that time, just during and after World War II. Europe was devastated. There was no, it was going to take a while for them to come back. Many European artists were still living in the United States, and American artists had also had benefited from works. The works project that was put into place after the Great Depression, and many of them had received public money to make art, and so they were being supported by our government, which was kind of interesting. It made New York this really vibrant city full of artists who were exchanging ideas in cafes and bars. Many of the surrealists, such as Dali and Breton, Leger, Mondrian, all of these Europeans were living in New York, and they had a great influence on many young American painters. A new style emerged from this mix. And who were very interested, especially in the surrealist subconscious techniques. And this group of mostly men. There were a few women in this group. They called themselves, their style, abstract expressionism, and they called themselves the New York School. It was a neutral label based on the fact that most of them lived in New York City. And these guys, and you're looking at a piece by Arshil Gorky, who was a Russian immigrant he was Armenian, an Armenian immigrant to the United States, who was kind of at the center of this core of younger artists who were playing with these ideas of abstract, of subconscious, of painting from your subconscious. Now, you guys remember we talked about the surrealists and how they were using Freudian technique and Freudian concepts of how the mind worked, and the ego, the superego, and the id. Well, the big difference between the European surrealists and the American automatic painters is that they were using the psychological philosophies of another psychologist named Carl Jung, who believed in a whole bunch of things, but one of his big ideas was that there was such a thing called the collective unconscious. Carl Jung believed that at our core as humans, we were all connected, emotionally, psychologically connected in this very deep place that was way below or above, however, but somehow not within our consciousness, but subconsciously all connected to one another. And that we can resonate with one another as humans, as animals almost, on this deeper level. And these artists loved this idea that if they painted from somewhere in their unconscious, in an abstract way that got their mind out of the way, that they could touch or communicate with other people through this unconscious, this collective unconscious connection that we all have with one another. It was a fascinating idea, and Gorky was this painter that we're looking at. He was older than the rest, and he was very much into that. Now, if this reminds you of some of the early expressionists, like Kandinsky, it should, because Gorky came out of that school and brought that to the United States and was kind of operating out of this idea. And so he was using shapes a lot like Kandinsky, colors and these kind of organic shapes that were meant to resonate somehow within somebody's kind of being. And it was from this leaping off point that some of our very famous American abstract expressionists started working. So this is the very early work, and I think you can maybe see the connection between Gorky here and this one of Jackson Pollock. And you can see that he's again using some letters, which is a little bit and words, a little bit like I think Picasso. He's folding in some of the expressionists like De Broek and de Blauweider, and he's kind of moving in that direction. You can see some symbolic shapes. This looks very feminine. This form here, you can see the eyes and the breasts. This maybe looks more masculine, and you can see these two kind of poles. So in the late, so Jackson Pollock was part of this group that was living in New York, and where these ideas were just fomenting in the bars where they would all hang out and talk. And Gorky's influence on all of these guys cannot be underestimated. Almost all of the painters who made it big in this movement resembled his work. So Gorky, this guy, all of them resembled Gorky's work early on, before they kind of branched out into their own style. This group of men and women had studios in abandoned warehouses all around the Soho district of New York. They spent a great deal of time with one another, visiting studios, drinking in local bars. And Gorky was the older mentor for all of these guys. He did not live far past the 1940s, which was unfortunate, because he didn't live past to see this style really catch on, which was kind of a shame. So, okay, this is Pollock. This is Jackson Pollock. This is the artist, Jackson Pollock, working on his canvases. And this is the art. This is Autumn Rhythm number 30, one of his most famous canvases. It's in the MoMA in New York. And this piece is one of Jackson Pollock's most famous pieces. And that's the style that he's well known for. In the late 40s, Pollock actually moved away from New York City. There's a really good docudrama about Pollock's life that you can look up and read and watch. He was an interesting guy. One would say that he was probably emotionally fragile, and he struggled with addiction, like alcoholism, et cetera. And he moved out of the city to a farm on Long Island with his wife, who was also a painter, Lee Krasner. And he worked in a large barn that he'd converted into his studio. And in the barn, there were a lot of cans of just latex paint, just paint for house paint. He decided to abandon his old style, and he unrolled these canvases. And you can kind of see this in this picture. You can see how the canvas, he hasn't even cut it. He's just rolled it out on the barn, on this huge barn floor. And you can see that he's standing on it, and he's just flinging paint using a brush, but sometimes he used a stick, and you can see other cans of paint behind him. And he would fling paint around the canvas, and then he would switch to another color and work more. And this is, so he moved to the country partly because he was really struggling with alcoholism, and one of the ways that the group was spending time together was drinking in bars, which was very unhealthy for him. And so as he got out into the country, he was able to kind of get a little cleaner and spend time really deciding and thinking, and just, I think maybe just acting on what he thought would be the best way for him to be able to access his subconscious, to create art that came directly from his subconscious without any conscious thought. And basically his art ended up being kind of this cool dance that he did on the canvas. And let's look at Autumn Rhythm. So this piece and Pollock's work isn't in the AP, but I think it's so important you have to know about it. So he spent time just dancing on these huge canvases. This one's really big. It's 17 feet 3 inches by almost 9 feet tall. And you can see how he flowing paint back and forth, and how he was using larger bits of paint and soupier bits of paint, and how sometimes it goes down thick, like the tan bits go down really thick, whereas the whites and the blacks are a little bit drippier, and how sometimes he's really splashing it down, and sometimes he's dribbling it down. And you can also see how he's moving his body back and forth, up and down over the canvas. And so the end product of the painting isn't so much about itself being the end, it's more about itself being evidence of the act. So it's much more about process than product. And that's what the abstract expressionists were all about. They were all about this process, getting into their subconscious, getting away from their thinking mind, and just doing what felt right to them. So this is, it's just so cool. So art critic Harold Rosenberg used the term action painting to describe Pollock's new work. And so the school The New York School of Abstract Expressionists broke into two rough groups. One were the action painters like Pollock, and another was the colored field painters like Mark Rothko, and we'll look at his work later. So action painting like Pollock, it's not, like I said, it really has to do, really has to do more with the process of putting the paint down than the end product. Although the end product is really lovely too. And I have to tell you that looking at it small on your computer doesn't do it justice. If you go to the MoMA at some point in the future, look at this. It's huge, and you can get lost in it. It's like looking at a mountainscape or a field or something where you just get lost in these layers and layers of paint. And the way that they move and dance and squiggle all around, and the interaction between the tan and the white and the black. And a little bit, his work was like the Cubists, in that he's pared down the color so that you didn't get stuck looking at color, but that you were just looking at the shapes and the forms of the squiggles, which is really interesting. He didn't care so much about the product as he did about the performance that was actually taking place in the making of the art. So Pollock used this very physical gestural approach as a substitute for the deliberate symbols that he had been painting. And the order of the canvas has to do with the rhythm and the method in which he was laying down, or splashing down, or dribbling down the paint. It pulls the viewer right into them like an environment. And it feels as if he's tapping into some sort of real primal force. And if you look at it, I think you can see how he moved. You can almost imagine how he laid this all down. Here's another one. This one's a little bit less focused, sorry, but it's a little bit more minimalist. So you can see how he was squiggling here and squiggling there. And here's another one that's a little bit more dense. This one looks a lot more like Monet's later paintings, so thickly painted. You almost lose the earlier layers of paint, and can only see the final coats of black and white that he lays over the top of the other colors. This is the work of his wife, Lee Krasner. And as you can see, her work is also large. It's also very gestural, but she's retaining some of those looser symbols. All right, so let's move on to the work of the abstract expressionist painter who is on the AP, and this is the work of Willem de Kooning. De Kooning was an immigrant to the US from the Netherlands. He was the other great leader of the New York School, and he had a very different approach, as you can see. He still used traditional paints, brushes, and canvas. He never fully wanted to break from images that you could see in the world. But he wanted to paint all these things with the greatest of emotional honesty. And he once said, "I work out of doubt." He wanted to divorce his conscious mind, again, just like Pollock, from the act of painting. He wanted to paint just like putting his subconscious blur directly on the canvas. Now, one of the cool things about de Kooning is he would attack his canvases, he would work and work and work and work, he would set it aside, then he would come back, he'd take down, he'd wipe out some paint, he'd put more down, and he'd paint over and over and over, and he would keep going and going and going until somehow he reached a final place where he thought that, okay, that was done. You can see he used a great deal of color in his work. That was all very important to him. And you can look and see imagery even in this piece. This piece is called Asheville, and it's a tribute to the school in North Carolina, where he went to school. He went to the Black Mountain School of Art, which was an absolute hotbed of artists working in this abstract expressionist and this conceptual art vein in the US, which is kind of cool. Asheville, North Carolina. And he taught there for a summer. You can see body parts, I think, like maybe breasts. You can see an eye, maybe. But you can also see all these. It almost looks a little bit like an aerial view of land, or just a cluster or a clump of abstract shapes, which is really really interesting. Some of it's very clear and very defined with line, and other areas are scraped out, brushed out. And it's really interesting. Okay, so this is the piece called Woman One. It was painted in 1950 to 1952. It's an oil on canvas. This is the piece on the AP. And this is probably one of his most famous pieces. He painted this. It's an oil on canvas, I said that. He painted this female figure with the gestural approach that was anything but dance-like and rhythmic. You can almost imagine him painting it, right? Look at the physicality of the brushwork. I mean, you could see him almost grabbing a brush and scrubbing the canvas or poking the canvas or slashing the canvas. There's a violence. You can see the act of painting. And it was not like Pollock's, which was dance-like and rhythmic. De Kooning was really attacking the canvas. It was a very physical approach, but much harsher than Pollock's, much more violent, but also not quite as elegant in the, Pollock would go and then be done and didn't overwork his canvases. Not de Kooning. De Kooning worked his canvases and reworked them and scrubbed them out and reworked them and scraped it out and reworked them. And actually, when you stand in front of his canvases, and I have to say they're big too, when you stand in front of his canvases, you can see areas, like a little tiny area like this in here, where you can see in 3 or 4 layers deep of color that's hidden way back behind the surface, like so many colors that have been laid over by other colors and scraped out by other colors. It's really amazing. It almost looks like a relief of like a topographical map. The paint is really really thick, and it's quite gorgeous. I have to say, his work up close is absolutely incredibly stunning. So let's address the elephant in the room, which is the figure. And I'm going to ask you this question. One of the things, and I'm sure you get from your reading, de Kooning claims not to have any bad feelings about women, and not to have wanted this image of a woman who looks so monstrous appear on the canvas. He didn't want it. That's what he says. But yet that's what kept coming back again and again. And if you Google him and you look up other work of his, especially the work from this period, this kind of image came up again and again and again. And of course, like other people, when he first exhibited this work, other artists hated it. They found it shocking and horrible. They found it, again, really, not physically beautiful. It seemed beastly and gross and disrespectful to women. And so he got, he was accused of misogyny and, all kinds of stuff. So here's the question I want to ask of you. I want you to look at this painting, and I want you to think about the painting style and the color and the composition and the eventual content, and what you've read and looked at in Khan Academy and what I've been talking to you about. I want you to tell me how you think this painting expresses de Kooning's subconscious. How does it express his subconsciousness? And you can take an opinion one way or the other about his feelings about women. I don't care. But because the woman is part of it. But how does it, all parts, color, painting, the whole thing, how does it express his subconscious mind? Now, he didn't want us to relate to it intellectually either. I mean, just like Kandinsky, he didn't want us to look at it and say, oh, that's like a horrible, scary woman. He wanted us to be able to relate to it based on color and shape and all that kind of stuff too. But the question is, can you get past the woman to be able to do it? It's really, really interesting. All right. And you might also think about how it relates to Picasso's Demoiselle d'Avignon, the piece that we already looked at. It's really, really interesting. All right. So The other person on the AP is this artist. Her name is Helen Frankenthaler, and she represents the other side of the other style that the New York school played with, which was color field paintings. It's another abstract. But as you can see, this idea of physically gestural brushwork was not part of the color field painters toolbox. They used large areas of pretty pure color to create these either abstract forms or non-forms, to be able to express that same idea of that subliminal or collective unconscious. Again, they didn't want us to look at it and say, oh, well, that looks like a map of India or whatever, and assign understanding based on what we think that thing is, not like a Rorschach test or something. So their automatic movement was much softer, and they added color in this way to create these big, expansive color fields. Interestingly, during the time in the 50s, Helen Frankenthaler and Lee Krasner, the other female artists, did not get anywhere near the attention that the male artists did. Purely sexist. There's no question. They were just as good, just as interesting. There's no question that they suffered from not being part of that boys' club and the prejudice against women and women artists. They suffered from lack of exposure to the public. Dealers didn't want to pick them up. The press didn't cover them. Critics dismissed their work. So it's not until now that some of these women are getting the exposure that they deserve. And so if you were to look back at old books, you might not even see some of these women, which is actually really beautiful when you think about it. Helen Frankenthaler worked on the floor like Pollock did, so that she could control the dripping and the way that the paint went down on the canvas. She liked to work on raw canvas, so it's not treated with gesso or anything, and it allowed the paint, the turpentine thinned oil paint, to soak into the canvas like a watercolor. Her images were much more graceful and lyrical, much softer, and instead of flinging the paint, she poured the paint onto the canvas. And because it was so thinned with turpentine, it doesn't eat away at the canvas the way just pure oil paint would. Her canvases are also very, very large, and so they would flow, and she couldn't control it necessarily. She might be able to pour some here and pour some there, and then add other colors or turpentine in to make colors disperse. But she did this in a very trying in a very subconscious way. She wasn't trying to consciously organize the color. She usually started a piece of work with a question in her mind, and she looked to answer this question with her painting. So like for this one, as you might have read in the book, her question was, well, what happens if I work with 3 different colors of blue? And what happens if I work with a large central shape? And then she would just go from there and just let it happen. She was a younger abstract expressionist painter. She was considered to be of the second generation, kind of after de Kooning and Jackson Pollock. And she was a forerunner to later painters named Kenneth Nolan and Morris Lewis, who became stain, quote unquote, stain painters. This is another Frankenthaler, a little bit more shape, but the same watercolory. These are very, very large. This is called Mountains and Sea, and it is almost 10 feet by 7 feet. It's huge. Here's another one. The other really famous color field painter was Mark Rothko. And Rothko, he was part of that boys club. He became very, very popular, very famous. And he was in that same group with Pollock and de Kooning. Rothko wanted to play with what happens if you put two different colors together, and he created these beautiful floating triangles. I have to tell you, I get a little bit, I don't know, not emotional, but I just love his work. I find his work to be incredibly spiritual. When you stand in front of his huge, enormous, they're huge, huge, huge paintings that, you know, you look up as far as you can and wide and down, and they're very, very large. You just disappear into them. And even though they're just like yellow, orange, and a darker orange, or whatever color combinations, the way that the subtle variations of the color within each field, and the edges and the beautiful soft edges that he created between one color, the background color, and the foreground color, and the way the two soft rectangles kind of float back and forth next to each other. It's just really it's, I don't know, it's gorgeous. They're just absolutely beautiful, and I think you can really disappear into them. Again, he was working with this idea of collective unconscious, and sometimes people said, you know, like, what the heck, you know, this is nothing. It's just two squares floating around. I mean, this is nothing. My kid could do this. I could do this. And people said that about all of these painters, but they had really, really high ideals, and they were trying for their very, very large works to achieve great results within the human, somehow deep into this human psyche. And any person not educated in what they were trying to achieve, so the lay viewer, somebody who comes into a museum or a gallery and just looks at it, would be like, you either loved it or it didn't resonate and you didn't get it. And critics, I have to say though, critics loved the abstract expressionists. They were very successful with critics and with the high-end buyers, the super wealthy, educated buyers. They were very, 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 very successful. So his was interesting. He was working with Friedrich Nietzsche's ideas of the two divergent human tendencies, which he called Dionysian or Apollonian. So this is the Greek god Dionysius, the god of wine, harvest, and inspiration, and Apollo, the messenger god of light, music, and truth. And I think another way to look at it would be spirit and earth, a little bit like Platonic thought. So again, he's working just like so many other artists have worked with this idea of the earthly and the spiritual realm. And to me, these look like windows into the spirit world. Personally, they really, obviously, really resonate with me. I'll show you a few others, and then we'll finish the sad story of the abstract expressionists. This is a later, one of the later works of Rothko. So although many of the abstract expressionists, especially the women, and de Kooning went on to live long lives and have really successful careers, the women less so. The two main characters, Pollock and Rothko, met very early ends. Jackson Pollock never could get a handle on his alcoholism and died early, died young in his 30s in a fatal car accident, driving home late one night on Long Island, drunk, which is so sad. And so his career was cut short. And Mark Rothko, one of his later paintings that you can see here, he was very successful, but his work got darker and darker as he descended into the depths of depression as an individual, and eventually committed suicide. He eventually killed himself, and which is very, very sad, because his work was spoke to so many people. So before I finish, and this is the end, but before I completely finish, the next thing we're going to talk about are the reactions to these painters. So I've only asked you two questions, and now I'm going to ask you at the very tail end of this one more question, which is, do you resonate with this, or does it just leave you like, what is she talking about? She's talking like she really loves it, but I don't see it. I don't get it. And so tell me, does it resonate with you? Tell me why, and which one, like whose work did you really like? And if it doesn't resonate with you, tell me why. I'm curious, because if it doesn't resonate with you, you're not alone. There were many people who felt like this art was completely inaccessible. Most people didn't understand it. Most people didn't like it. They didn't get it, and they thought it was like really snooty, super, like only the arty people, only the super elite would ever want or get this work. And remember, it was all really huge, big work. And so it was expensive, and only people with giant walls and giant houses or big corporations could afford it. So it was really inaccessible in a lot of ways. Of course, a lot of it is owned by museums, so you can see this work. It doesn't only belong to rich people and corporations. But so answer me that question, and that's a really good place to stop, because when we pick up with pop art was a big reaction to abstract expressionism and the inaccessibility of abstract expressionism. So we'll take it from there.